very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Peter, for inviting me here, and it's great to be here. Um, my paper today is based on a new project, as Peter mentioned there, that I've recently embarked upon at the Institute of Irish Studies in Liverpool, and which I plan to develop next year uh, with the Newman Fellowship in UCD, and it will eventually result in a book entitled something along the lines of a technological history of the Great Irish Famine. At present, the research is still in relatively early stages. So in my fellows, I'm going to sort of foreground my basic approach and provide an overview of some major parts of the project and some kind of initial ideas. So bear with me in that regard. It's still very much a work in progress. The paper will explore two broad categories of technology. Firstly, what I'm calling technologies of exchange, including logistical innovations, and I'm mainly going to focus on rail and steam. And the second category of technologies I'm calling technologies of relief, focusing on the Scientific Commission, briefly mentioning or talking a little bit about public works, and then we go into a longer discussion about soup kitchens. So there's a general focus here on the earlier, so the first half of the famine, as opposed to the entire. I'm not saying much about the poor law, the workhouse. And I suppose the main theme running through the paper, and really at the kind of core of my argument as it is at the moment, is about the agency of these technologies in constituting the boundaries between market and state in Ireland during the famine. But before I dive into this, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see this project fitting into the historiography, and what I think can be gained, I think, from moving away from an exclusive focus on either kind of human factors, if you like, or human agency on the one hand, and natural or, if you like, biological agency in the sense of the blight itself. So as the title of the paper suggests, the central objective of the research is to provide the first critical analysis of the role played by technology in the famine. And in so doing, I hope to help to develop our understanding of the events of the late 1840s and early 1850s in at least two significant ways. Firstly, really by challenging the notion that the famine affected Ireland solely in the context of social and economic backwardness. And secondly, I think by offering a new perspective on the central issues of culpability and intention, which have dominated famine historiography in Ireland for a long time. And by placing technology at the centre of the crisis, I'm chiefly interested in exploring the agency of what you might call really existing physical systems. So clocks, steam engines, soup boilers, weighing scales, billets, these kind of items, insofar as how they relate to systems. That's just to name but a few. And as I mentioned before, as opposed to a sole focus either on human actors on the one hand or quote-unquote natural actors on the other. I think it's by moving beyond this dichotomy, which I think is often implicit in writing about the famine, and this is kind of what social scientists often refer to as the nature-culture divide, and that I hope to shine new light, both empirically in terms of focusing on dimensions of the famine experience which I think at the moment remain invisible or at least quite elusive, and then secondarily from a conceptual point of view, insofar as I hope this approach will open up some new avenues for interpretation and analysis. So on the first point about reassessing Ireland's putative backwardness, what I want to do is to resituate the famine amidst a sort of profound watershed in technological innovation. Due to its proximity to the world's first industrialised economy, of course, Ireland was exposed to the disruptive effects of a fast receding technological horizon, really before most similar European economies, and even before some more developed European economies. So, for example, playing host to the continent's second railway line outside Britain in 1834, the world's first transatlantic steamship in 1838, and its second submarine telegraph in 1853, to name just three examples. So I suppose a central question, therefore, is to what extent Ireland's economic modernity, understood in terms of technological development, mitigated or sharpened the famine by ultimately shaping food entitlements. That's what I'm interested in. This recognition in turn raises the question of whether the famine occurred as it did not only because singular social and economic support systems failed catastrophically, but because many thousands of individual processes functioned flawlessly. And so most of these physical systems, even obvious ones like rail and steam, I think remain strangely absent from most analysis of the famine. And the point here, I think, is to bring them into focus, to make them visible, and to assess their agency, as I've said, in terms of both the natural and human forces which sort of demanded and deployed them at various times. Now, I'm aware that it might sound a little bit essentialist to speak about environmental versus man-made forces as pervading sort of wide debates about the famine, but I do think that there's a real tension here, which is being identified by scholars adopting new approaches to the period. So, for example, the historian of science, Christopher Hamlin, has recently noted in famine scholarship. He says, quote, "The degree that environmental and medical factors manifest only as alternatives to human doings remains problematic." And I think a similar recognition actually runs through new work on the materiality and visual culture of the famine, including a groundbreaking collection of essays, which I believe was recently launched in this place. So one of the reasons this duality, I think, has proved so enduring is because it's actually hardwired into foundational narratives of the famine, which assume, if you like, on the one hand, in classic Mitchellite formulation, a sort of godlike agency on behalf of a small coterie of bureaucratic and political elites, and then on the other hand, nature really is mobilized as a sort of deus ex machina in a providential formulation. And I think there are echoes of these accounts sort of at the extremes of the literature in terms of seeing the famine as a sort of quote-unquote natural disaster or as a high political plot and so on. But I also think that for the majority of scholars working since the 1990s within, let's say, a sophisticated, broadly sort of post-revisionist analysis or framework, analysis of what I think James Connolly originally stressed as being a more complex confluence of abstract economic forces and political ideology is not free from its own blind spots. And I think one of these blind spots has been the material, and what in other contexts I think might be termed almost the everyday life, if you like, of famine victims in Ireland, if you could use that term. And I conceive of this myself, of an approach, as one of low as opposed to high political economy, so sort of the low politics of political economy and the material. And I think a benefit of this focus is that by alighting on infrastructure in particular, it provides a new way to capture the relationship between the state and the market in mid-century Ireland. And this is a theme which we'll run through the examples I'm going to discuss. Following Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian anthropologist, I think the notion that state power is a prerequisite for the market, that in his own words, quote, "economic liberals must and will unhesitatingly call for the intervention of the state in order to establish it, and once established, in order to maintain it." This is especially relevant, I think, in relation to physical systems, the sort of hardware of the state and the market. So in Ireland, because technology, for example, like the railway network, was acknowledged as constituting market relations in a way that the state actively supported, it emerged in the famine as an agent of the state in terms of both coercive force and relief, and the market in terms of, obviously, the conveyance of people and goods. But rather than seeing something like the railways merely as a sort of slave of the market or the state, I want to approach it as a network which is also sort of acting out a technical logic of its own in some ways. And this raises a central conceptual issue underlying this research, which is namely, how can inanimate things have agency? And here I'm drawing on work of the anthropologist Bruno Latour and the wider so-called material turn in Anglo-American and continental historiography associated with people like Patrick Joyce and even older historiography, I think, like Ferdinand Bardell, for example, interested in materiality and so on. The point here is not to fetishize or to anthropomorphize objects, but to dissemble abstract entities like the state of the market in terms of the physical and material processes which constitute them, and in doing so to capture the autonomy and contingency of these systems. And I must say as well, nor is the point to remove the human archaeological factor, but to consider the ways in which material systems mold human behavior and reshape environments in the way that they operate. Indeed, I think questions surrounding the agency of technology are very much pervade our own culture today, in ways which seem actually quite instinctive to us. Just think about kind of panics around AI, big data, the use of smartphones in shaping our behavior, how these technologies raise questions about human autonomy, human integrity, even human freedom. And you don't need to go very far for that. So if you think of television shows like Black Mirror, this is for people who watch Netflix, I conceive of my project as sort of Black Mirror meets Black 47. So I think, having fleshed out where I'm coming from and how I think a technological approach can potentially open up new perspectives on the famine, I want to now to move on to explore some concrete examples. And I think thinking about emerging technologies of exchange, which largely coincided with the famine, an obvious starting point is the railway system. So on the eve of the famine, Ireland possessed 65 miles of track controlled by three companies: Ulster Railway Company, the Dublin and Drogheda, and the Dublin and Kingstown. And although relatively small in scale, certainly the two Dublin lines probably wouldn't have come into fruition without fairly significant early state support by the Border Works. But not, having said that, their place in the sort of broader universe of global railway history is not insignificant. So, Ireland is the fourth country in the world to have a railway, to have a public steam locomotive railway system, I should say, in the shape of the 6-mile Dublin and Kingstown line, which opened in 1834. And this is, and I like this, ostensibly the world's first dedicated commuter line, which I think actually says something very interesting about what's going on in Dublin in the 1830s in terms of where the Dublin bourgeoisie want to put their money, right? They're actually privileging, removing themselves from the city centre above even goods, industry, freight, and so on. But that's a separate story. Because the famine began the same year as the explosion in speculative financing, which was known as railway mania at the time, and the period between 45 and 52 saw the extent of Ireland's railway network explode. So there's over tenfold increase in the mileage from 65, as I said, just before the famine, to 710 miles in 1852. And this really includes what we now recognise the premier lines on the island of Ireland today, connecting cities of Cork, Limerick, Galway, Belfast, Dublin, which are all, in a very real sense, technological, I suppose, and archaeological artefacts of the famine era. It's an amazing fact I came across earlier in my research. More stations opened in 1848 than any other year in the entire 19th century, bar one. And I like that. I'm capturing that here, and you can see the large spike. The scale of public and private investment, of course, required to bring this about was considerable. Domestic investment in Irish railways, which varied at between kind of a half and then later on was about 3/4 of investment, rose from £1 million just on the eve of the famine to £7 million in 1852. So to put this in perspective, the total cost of the British Treasury of famine relief in Ireland came to roughly £10 million, and about £8 million was paid in tax by Irish ratepayers over the same period. So domestic railway investments, in other words, during the famine, probably outstripped all private charity by a factor of 5 or 6. This is quite remarkable. 145 stations open up. I think this is the best way to convey the sort of the novelty of the lines. So the darker ones is pre-1845, and everything else is opening in these various years according to the colour scheme there. So it'll give you an idea of the speed and the pace at which the expansion was taking place. The funny thing about this is that the whole history of railways remain, I think quite literally in many cases, an actual footnote, if at all, in most histories of the famine. It tends to be brought up as quickly as it's dismissed as part of a sort of catalogue of failure. Firstly apparent in the failure of the Drummond Commission of 1836, which was headed up by a popular Irish Under-Secretary, Thomas Drummond, which advocated extensive state support for railways, didn't really materialise, seen as a first major failure. And then this is sort of repeated in a way about a decade later in 1847, when the leader of the Tory protectionists, Lord George Bentinck, proposes a massive £16 million investment in the railway system in Ireland in the midst of the famine as a mode of famine relief, and neither does this materialise, to the great disappointment of a whole range of characters in Ireland. In the end, in 1847, Russell comes up with £620,000, which obviously pales in comparison to 16 million, but when compared to, say, the total outlay for soup kitchens, it's about a third of that figure. And if we look at the period from 49 to 54, so just 2 years beyond the famine, the total figure for state support, and this is a combination of loans and subventions, is actually £1.8 million, which is really significant. So at the height, between 46 and 48, railways were employing 40,000 men, supporting probably somewhere between 150 and 200,000. And then by the time the system was finished, so in 1853, I shouldn't say finished, but once the famine had ended, it was catering to about 7 million passengers a year. and remarkably, Irish trains were much more profitable. Irish Rail was much more profitable at the end of the famine than even English railway companies that are paying higher dividends. The invisibility of railways in famine history, I think, represents quite a serious lacuna, considering the new technology absorbed so much capital and labour, and also mainly because it really revolutionised the transport system within a relatively short and chaotic period. Most trains in Ireland that were introduced in the famine period went at 20 miles per hour, which probably just seems quite slow to us. But this was more than twice probably the speed of the average coach. Well, it was about twice the speed of the fastest coach. The real revolution is in freight, though. So it's far faster than you can achieve on any of the canals, for example. While in 1845, for example, goods traffic from Galway to Dublin took probably at least 4 days. By 1851, when the Galway station had opened, this had been reduced to 10 hours, right? And that meant that Galway was now as close to Dublin as Maynooth had been 6 years before. So part of the problem, I think, has been the perceived difficulty of assembling reliable data on the initial impact of the train system, and this in turn reflects the prominence of econometric style approaches to Irish history, or within Irish famine history more widely. Interventions by scholars like Peter Solar have rightfully cast doubt on statistics on trade and internal trade within the Drummond Commission report, and then a very widely cited scholarly essay by Liam Kennedy had sought in vain to find kind of meaningful correlations between regional patterns of agriculture and the spread of railways after the famine. But the subject hasn't really been revisited since. Of course, the doyen of railway history in Ireland, which I should say is a field that has otherwise suffered almost terminal neglect amongst academic historians, is of course Joe Lee, whose early work essentially provided, I think, a jumping off point for his subsequent modernisation narrative of post-famine history. And I think the link between the two is really important, actually, because railways serve as a kind of champion, a sort of exemplar, sort of driver of the story of modernisation. They're really critical to it. So this is my theory of Joe Lee. It begins with trains and it sort of becomes modernisation. As several generations of criticism of modernisation theory have, of course, demonstrated by now, this approach carries, its own normative assumptions about what modernity is, what it should be. It's an essentially Whiggish story about the inevitability of liberal capitalist forms generated in the context of the early Cold War era. Now, in a telling remark at the opening of a fine essay published 50 years ago, Lee speculates that the impact of the railways had been so underrated by Irish historians partly because they coincided with the famine itself, meaning it was difficult to disentangle the essentially positive changes that they brought about from the wider transformation wrought by the famine. And he goes on to list these changes for which railways deserve credit, at least partial credit, as rising rates of consumption, enhanced communication, market integration, and so on. And I think it's particularly in relation to the last of these, so market integration, that we see occasional references to the likely impact of railways on famine and post-famine society as a sort of unqualified force for good. Cormac O'Grada, for example, implies this, I think, in several of his books and articles by downplaying the impact of railways in the 1840s, but then emphasising, by comparison, their positive role in a later period of scarcity, the Gurt Beag in the 1870s, for example. I think that point about modernity and railways is quite striking. This is the Dalkey Atmospheric Railway in 1844, and I think just as today, light transport in particular carries this sort of powerful image of modernity, and this is very much a sort of almost a modern, a very evocative modern image. It's a celebratory image, a positive image. And I think there's certainly strong faith in the messianic properties of railways as well amongst the dedicated enthusiasts, of which there are a legion actually out there. So I went to the Irish Railway Records Society library, fantastic library in Houston Station recently, and I told them I was interested in famines and railway, and they sort of looked at me and said, but there were no famines. There was no famine where there were railways, because, how could there be, sort of thing. And I think even in a recent book, if we see this, for example, it was a really recent book came out on William Dargan as a sort of railways champion, if you like. And again, the kind of tone is quite celebratory, and it's railways as really a force for good, and railways as a sort of positive, constructive investment, a sort of image of entrepreneurship. And this is really reflected in contemporary reports. So it's very hard to find actually images, even etchings, even in the Illustrated London News, of railways during the famine. I mean, this is one of them, probably the most best known ones, the opening of the Cork Blackrock and Passage Railway in 1850. And it's really an image about so the civility of Cork's bourgeoisie as people look on as they look on themselves. And it's actually compositionally quite similar to the Dalkey one. But there's really no sense that the famine is actually happening. And this tells us a lot about how, sort of the discourse in which railways are being thought about and written about it and represented at this time. I think if we step back, some of the assumptions underlying the general silence about railways and famine in Ireland become even more striking if we compare them to, say, Indian historiography. The latter boasts long-running debates about the relationship between railways and famine, with several devastating scarcity events obviously coinciding with the spread of the railway system in the 1870s. So, for example, this image from the graphic from 1877 during the Great Famine of 76 to 78, which is part of a broader series of images and journalism which is depicting, the relationship between infrastructure technologies, exportation of food, and the role of railways in this, and counterposing these with images of starving bodies, emaciated bodies, and so on. This is an old, but it's an ongoing debate within Indian historiography. So, for example, one of the most recent interventions by MIT economist Dave Donaldson helped to win the John Bates Clark Medal in 2017, which is sort of the second most prestigious award after the Nobel Prize for Economics. And this is in part to do with his work on the role of market integration, trade and welfare gains, and railways in late 19th and early 20th century India. His was an essentially affirmative kind of neoclassical story about railways as harbingers of modernisation. But on the other hand, you have economists ranging from Bal Bhatia writing in the 50s and 60s through to critical famine theorists like Amartya Sen and Mike Davis, all of whom point to the potentially really quite devastating shock therapy effects of new technologies like rail and like telegraphy on rural communities in the short term at least. I think as historian Ian Kerr has noted in a recent review of Donaldson's work, while cliometrics can of course indicate secular long-term growth patterns at a macro level, they often obscure short-term effects, distributional consequences, inequalities, uneven development, and so on. So while it may be impossible to quantify the short-run effects of railways in Ireland in the late 1840s and early 1850s in the same way that has been achieved for elsewhere, although I am working through the agricultural statistics, but that's wrought with difficulties. I do think actually what will emerge in the end is a wealth of sources out there to inform a critical social history of railways, which are not necessarily solely data driven. So we're going to have to rely on a broader range of sources, now including narrative sources. And so one of these, for example, writing from Carlow in January 1847, less than 6 months after the town became one of the first interior counties of Ireland to be brought into a Dublin-centric rail system outside of Drogheda, and the radical Manchester Examiner journalist Alexander Somerville noted, he said, "It is questionable if any other part of Ireland is so well conditioned. The railway terminus has centred in this place the whole traffic of the south and west of Ireland with Dublin. The hotels were never so full before, shopkeepers were never more busy, mills are grinding night and day, and farmers had never better prices, with more corn to sell. The sufferers are the labouring poor, the quarter-acre men, the smallholders, and the small farmers whose holdings are under 10 acres. I think what this description captures so vividly is the way in which the arrival of the railway served to sort of sharpen the contradictions of Ireland's famine-era political economy. It's also possible to perceive here just how quickly I think railway stations became vital nodes in a network of accelerated commodity flows between markets in the provinces and the capital and beyond. Many other visitors' accounts which involve rail travel during the famine stress the constant presence of the begging poor, of course, at stations where food and provisions and the well-to-do travellers, of course, disembark. But of course, railways, trains and stations fundamentally altered the physical fabric of travel in crucial ways. So writing from Limerick, a city which when he was writing hadn't been connected to a railway network but would be within 6 months, Somerville, a former soldier, celebrated the rationalising effect of the railway on the securitization, what you might call the securitization of commodity flows. So he wrote, railways will do much good to Ireland that it would be well to facilitate their construction. The food of Ireland is coming to our shores as hard corn. That corn has to be carted great distances to mills to be ground to meal. The meal has to be carted greater distances for distribution. In order to have the escort of military guards, the carts and horses and men, a man to each, are restricted in their locomotion. With the harassed, wearied, worn-out soldiery, not numerous enough, great as their numerical strength is in Ireland, to furnish guards so frequently as the carts are loaded and ready to move. With this disadvantage, they must again delay. I think it's interesting to reflect that it is the steamship, actually, rather than the rail carriage, which became emblematic of the flow of commodities away from vulnerable populations in a way which highlights overseas trade rather than market systems within Ireland for criticism. The relative invisibility, even in contemporary polemics, of a system fueled by Irish capital shifting food within Ireland echoes, I think, the modern silence around the origins of the system, actually. Somerville's hopes for secured train carriages and stations replacing the need for soldiers also speaks to the point I made earlier, I think, about the way in which technologies like rail could help to constitute the division between the state and the market through its materiality. This was not necessarily a straightforward process, so the minutes of books of almost all the railway companies I've looked at for the famine period show a recurring concern with procuring the services of the constabulary. For example, in October 1845, the Great Southern and Western Railway ordered its solicitor Sir Matthew Barrington to, quote, furnish the board with a copy of the Act of Parliament which requires police to be placed on the railways and to require such assistance, end quote. But it is also true that the novel speed and power of the railway system also revolutionised the capacity of the state, right, both central and local, to pursue its own immediate objectives. And we can think particularly in terms of troop movements for the central state. But in terms of local government, we can draw actually an interesting contrast between Belfast and Cork at this time. At this point of the early phase of the famine, where Belfast had access to a rail system, a quite well constructed rail system. And Cork didn't yet, or Cork was in the process of construction. So in April 1847, the Cork Examiner reported, quote, incursions of rustic paupers into the city, which continues unabated. They wait on the outskirts of the town till dark, when they may be seen coming in droves, walking masses of filth, vermin, and sickness. It's quite a well-known quote. The reason they arrived at night, of course, was because during the day there was a cordon of special constables which surrounded the city boundaries in order to physically expel the migrants. In Belfast, not only did the Ulster Railway agree to distribute the relief packages of the British Association for free of charge, it also offered the corporation a reduced rate for the removal of thousands of so-called strange paupers, but actually the vast majority were from Antrim and Down, to be relocated outside the city. So mobilisation of the railways here as a form of kind of biopolitics. Incidentally, actually, the potential of railways to act as vectors of disease in their own right, which is a point that's made in the Indian literature, represents another total gaping gap in the medical history of the famine, such as it is. The physical capacity of railways to speed up the movement of people and resources in space and time also encountered some obvious practical limitations. Ireland had 17 different railway companies by 1852. Some of them used different gauges, different materials, different designs. And in this practical sense, I think railways only became truly international networks when they physically crossed borders, as they would in the continent, but which really has remained impossible for an island like Ireland up until today. I think, though, if we take a step back and think of the emergence of a global railway system as an inherently interconnected phenomenon, like linked by flows of labour, by flows of capital, by flows of knowledge, for example, and we can begin to appreciate a kind of wider universe, or a wider universe of interaction, of cause and effect. And an obvious example of this is the context of the famine. In the context of the famine is a sudden crash of the railway mania, boom from about 1846, which has helped to fuel much early speculation in Irish railways, as I mentioned. And in this In his early work, Lee went to great pains to emphasise that, in his own words, quote, the Irish railway system was in fact largely a byproduct of the British investment cycle, and that, quote, it was the reaction in the stock market after 1845, not the famine per se, that reduced the flow of funds to the companies. And now it's taken modern British rail historians to point out, really, over the past 10, 20, 30 years, that actually, surprised, the famine did actually have a massive impact on demand for British railways in all sorts of ways, and actually was a factor in the ending of the boom in and of itself. And so, for example, the cancellation of the South Wales Railway because of a quote, collapse in trade with Ireland, according to the Contemporary report. And conversely, of course, British companies like this Great South Western became really important cogs in the relief machine by conveying food aid free of charge. I think more widely than this even, there's also the phenomenon of Irish railway workers sending money across the Atlantic Ocean as well as across the Irish Sea. So these include, we have records suggesting these include, amongst others, contributions from navvies on the Bury Railway in Lancashire and the Aberdare Railway in Wales, alongside those working on the Lowell Railway in Massachusetts, as just a few examples. I think a case of what we might term this wider North Atlantic railway system as a sort of super object, if you like, affecting the localised network in Ireland can also be seen in terms of the flow of migrants to work on the British and American railways, which in turn impacted on the very strict structure of the Irish rail system. And special trains used to be put on from west to east, specifically to cater for seasonal railway workers by railways in Ireland for railways in the UK. In Britain. The complexity of Ireland's semi-peripheral position with this wider transnational technological network would later be felt in the 1870s, for example, when penetration of US railways into the Midwest contributed to an agricultural depression, which was prevented from developing to a full-blown famine in Ireland, partly because of railway penetration to the west of Ireland. And I think the point is here that as technologies of integration and globalization, railways were ambivalent forces in the creation of winners as well as losers, in Ireland as much as elsewhere. And we must, particularly with railways, this deceptive sort of determinism and teleology of technology must be kind of shook off, I think. And I think this brings us naturally onto the next of the major transport technologies I want to touch upon in relation to the famine, which is the steamship. A study published in 2007 by the US National Academy of Sciences finally confirmed what we suspected for a long time, which is that Phaeophistoria infestans originated in Peru and essentially infected European potato populations because of steam travel, essentially likely because of steam travel. It had existed before, but the speculation is that under the sail, essentially the potatoes would have rotted in the amount of time. So it was literally the kind of time-space compression of steam, which is the agent, if you like, that creates the possibility for the famine in the first place. The idea of the steam revolution as an engine of globalization is certainly intuitive in this sense. But I think the fact that steam became common in Ireland from the 1820s creates a more complicated picture. The first regular steamboat service across the Irish Sea began in 1818 between Belfast and Glasgow, while the City of Dublin Steam Packet Company launched a regular cargo steamer 5 years later. By 1830 there were 42 steamers plying the Irish Sea, controlled by 16 different companies, and as I mentioned, in 1838 the Sirius crossed the Atlantic. Nearly half of all steamship tonnage that entered British ports by the end of the 1830s came from Ireland, which is quite remarkable. On the eve of the famine, in February 1844, Prime Minister Robert Peel could tell Parliament he had much cause for entertaining bright hopes for the future of Ireland. By the wonderful applications of science, we are about to shorten the physical distance. I should not be surprised if, even during my own lifetime, we are able, by its aid, to bring Dublin nearer to London than many towns in England now are. Of course, the flip side of this was, of course, that it took a third less time to get from Dublin to Liverpool on steam packet than it did to get from Dublin to Galway on a mail coach. And that's just if you're travelling in person. In terms of goods, you're talking about a multiple of a number of days. So I think what we see with the role played by steam-powered shipping during the famine is actually less a straightforward story about technology playing handmaid to globalization via emigration and trade and relief and so on. And it's much more a story about the complex, uneven development within Ireland The late 1840s and 50s was a period in which sail and steam still very much coexisted, and the more sophisticated technology did not replace the less sophisticated until the 1860s and 1870s in terms of the Atlantic crossing. So while Ireland and Britain had become tightly interconnected to one another through a dense network of steamship routes linking cities all over the east coast of Ireland with cities in Scotland and Wales and England, the entire west coast of Ireland possessed only one such route in the 1840s, which is namely from Sligo to Liverpool. And on that route, passengers notoriously suffocated in 1848. The legislative context for this is complex. It's market harmonisation within the bounds of protection between the 1820s and repeal of the Corn Laws, but it's also repeal of the Passenger Act and up to the repeal of the Navigation Acts, really between 1826 and 1849 as well. As rates of immigration reached 200,000 per annum in the late 1840s, this completely overwhelmed the capacity of the Irish shipping trade, which had a maximum capacity of probably about 35,000, and a majority of those who did embark for America likely did so under the sail. Where steam power, state-backed in the form of navy steamers and subsidised freight vessels after 1847, did come into play, it was as a desperate measure to supply an isolated west coast stretching in Trevelyan's terms from Skibbereen to Donegal with emergency aid, which you can see here. This is an image of the steam. This is on one particular day, 1st of February 1847. It's a map of where military steamships were, navy steamers were. So as the power of steam exerted a powerful set of gravitational push and pull effects on Ireland, unlike rail, which probably centralised and intensified the political economy of trade and relief within the country, steam revealed and prized open deep social and geographical fissures. In its manifestation during the famine, then, steam, like rail, served both market and state alike, but it did so according to a peculiar geopolitical economy, if you like, of its own. One it had helped to establish and shape. On the one hand, the militarisation of the west coast through a combination of war steamers and the use of coastguards as relief depots was, on the other hand, matched by steam as the primary technology of exchange and emigration to the east. So, in other words, steam functioned as a market technology which integrated state on the eastern board, and it operated as a state technology which sought to address market collapse in the west. Another way of thinking about this is that steam was as much the long-term agent of as it was the short-term antidote to the profound inequalities which existed in Irish society and which were exploding under the pressures of the famine. Moving on now to think about more specific technologies of relief, this tension between the state and the market, I think, and the agency of technology in helping to constitute both becomes even more evident. The point here, though, is not, of course, to write out politics or to sidestep the role of elites who did wield unprecedented power through the deployment of technologies. So if we look, for example, I think before I move on to discuss these in more detail, I want to briefly say something about how I think such technologies also help to feed back into and fabricate new attitudes to government, which were becoming apparent in the 1840s. I think if we just need to look at the figure of Charles Trevelyan himself, although of course his name is attached to the civil service reforms he proposed in the 1850s, and this has been recognised by Oliver MacDonagh, was recognised by Oliver MacDonagh 60 years ago as a cornerstone of what he called the 19th century revolution in government. A link between this and his role in the famine hasn't really been fleshed out, I think. But to my mind, I think both make sense in terms of an emergent governmentality, if you like, which might best be described as technocratic. MacDonagh described the high point of the revolution as resulting in bureaucrats who, quote, strove to get and to keep in touch with inventions and new techniques and called directly upon medicine and engineering and the infant professions of research chemistry and biology to find answers to intractable difficulties, end quote. And of course then, and MacDonagh cites W.L. Byrne's famous quote about Ireland being a site of experimentation. In this context, it makes sense that the Scientific Commission of 1845, which was created by Peel to provide objective insights into the potato blight from experts, was, as far as I know, I think the first of its kind to be framed in this way by a British government. So that there had been talk in the 1830s of a scientific commission into mining, for example, but never really materialised. And any other reference that I've found to scientific commissions in government papers is in relation to French or Prussian precedents. So the scientific commission is itself an interesting historical juncture in itself. The characterisation of the humanitarian crisis in Ireland as a series of technical problems with potentially technical fixes, I think, pervaded official attitudes from the outset. As in Trevelyan's own terms, the crisis saw, quote, extensive experiments in the science of relieving the destitute. Some of these initial experiments arose directly out of the Scientific Commission's final report published by Lauren Playfair, John Lindley and Robert Kane on the 15th of November 1845. The Commissioner suggested on how to achieve this involved a set of technical fixes beginning with the construction of lime kilns and ventilation pits to dry potatoes, with government circulation of 70,000 copies of these instructions, including to every parish priest in the country and every newspaper and so on. Under the influence of Liebeggian plant biologist George Phillips, Kane and his colleagues also recommended the fabrication of machines to salvage diseased potatoes by pulping them into starch and then combining this with oatmeal or flour to form edible alternatives. The Commission produced instructions for the home manufacture of graters by puncturing tin sheets and so on. The Royal Agricultural Improvement Society held a competition for somebody to invent the best potato machine, as they called them, for grating potatoes, and some poor law unions then bought into these. Of course, all of these experiments, including experiments in pesticides, failed, including wilder ones linked to trying to conduct lightning and use chlorine and so on. I think, as Ian Miller has rightly suggested in his recent book, these accounts and the opposition that they inevitably sparked, in his words, spoke to, quote, far broader debates about self-help and state intervention. And although this early phase of optimism ended abruptly, I think the methods, the realization that these methods were, because of the realization that these methods were useless in combating the blight, the underlying ideological function of technology and a technocratic mindset went on to pervade, I think, all subsequent iterations of famine policy. The earliest of these, of course, initiated by Peel, was a dual strategy of importation of Indian meal, which was aided by the repeal of the Corn Laws, and public works, which began in December 1845 and lasted until March 47, with the most expensive single relief policy. Four Acts passed in March 1846 promoted works aimed at the development of fisheries, harbours, drainage, improvement of estates, and the construction and repair of roads. And of course, the construction and repair of roads became by far the most widespread. They remain synonymous with images of backbreaking work on roads to nowhere. This is a modern image, which represent the ultimate in kind of low-tech, low-utility, punitive labour. And I think at the time, and also now in some implicit and explicit ways, they're contrasted to the railways, actually, as kind of productive, inherently high-tech work. These works did not involve, of course, involve basic tools, which had to be supplied. And there's great stuff in the papers. Trevelyan worrying about how all these specially procured shovels and wheelbarrows are going to be stored and whether they're going to be wasted and how they should be given to poor law unions and so on. This was all grist to the mill of Trevelyan's own profound dislike of public works as what he called a bounty on interested exaggeration. But in his own account of famine relief, Trevelyan notes probably the most significant material intervention without which the entire system of public works would have ceased to function in the way that it was supposed to. The most important intended outcome of the public works schemes, after all, was to complement a free market approach by integrating the rural poor into the cash economy through wage payment in money, which had been a major feature of debate surrounding social and economic policy in Ireland over the previous 2 decades. What was required to achieve this was money itself, as in the physical specie in small denominations. Trevelyan noted, such as this. Trevelyan notes, the silver currency, which had previously sufficed for a people who lived upon potatoes grown by themselves and paid their rent by so many days' labour, fell short of what was required to pay the labourers employed on numerous relief works, and a large supply was therefore distributed by means of government steamer among the principal towns on the coast of Ireland. And he notes in an aside that after the public works ended, all of this money which had collected into local banks was taken and sent to South Africa to, quote, aid in carrying on what we now call this the Seventh Xhosa War in 1846-47. So this may appear so banal as to be uninteresting, but I think it is significant because of the way in which technologies of relief played such a vital role in constituting the boundary between market and state during the famine. So during the trade liberalisation public works phase, cash was a material intervention because an underlying logic of these policies was to transition toward the reintegration of landless and semi-landless peasants into the market economy. The government intervened, albeit in a way intended to be least disruptive to the rest of the economy, in order to encourage people to become purchasers in the market. Right? So the key material intervention in relation to this policy, more than shovels and wheelbarrows, was money itself. After the passage of the Temporary Relief Act in February 1847, which of course created soup kitchens, the public works were phased out as the Russell government moved toward a reterritorialisation of famine relief around the domestic poor law system. Now, the poor law system, which was funded locally and then nationally within Ireland later on, provided relief by definition outside the market, by cordoning off a physical site where indoor relief was provided subject to a workhouse test. The soup kitchen project, which had fed 3 million people at its height, was a transition phase towards sole use of the poor law because it saw the state intervene to do exactly the opposite of what the public works were supposed to do, namely to prevent people using aid relief in the market economy. And the single most important technological intervention which shaped this was the boiler. Now, soup and soup boilers were both themselves the subject of technological innovation throughout this period. The chef of the Reform Club, Alexis Sawyer, developed a new form of steam boiler himself and showcased it in model soup kitchens in Dublin in April 1847 and was feted by the establishment for doing so. This was a 300-gallon cast iron soup boiler pitted alongside narrow benches and a chain attached spoons. Archbishop John McHale famously derisively called him one of Russell's Pythagorean cooks. But I think even before soup kitchens opened, when food aid was mostly being provided in the form of Indian meal, a debate occurred amongst administrators on the merits of two alternative forms of adaptive technology, the boiler and the hand mill. The struggle played out in the correspondence between advocates of the likes of Papin's digester. This is Sawyer soup kitchen. This is Papin's digester, which was a steam cooker so strong that it was capable of melting bones, and that was attractive for using animal waste as food. And later, Colebrook Dale iron boilers on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you had a whole range of French, Scottish, and locally produced hand mills, such as including traditional kernstones on the other. Early instruction for preparation of the Indian meal pointed out that it could be both ground and boiled, whole for conversion into edible form, but the latter method ultimately won out. By late September 1846, Trevelyan was forwarding to Relief Commission Chief Randolph Ruth news of what he termed an experiment which had been carried out by Captain Ernest Percival, which revealed in his words that Indian corn may, by being properly soaked and boiled, be eaten whole. And when circulated to others the same month, Commissary General William Houston, who was in charge of the disposal of imported corn from the Lee mills in Cork, wrote to Trevelyan in October 1846, suggesting that the quantity of wheat and oats coming daily into this city for exportation is very large, as also at the neighbouring ports. The mill power too is becoming in request. I have tried Captain Percival's receipt with the whole corn. It was steeped 12 hours in cold water and well boiled 3 hours and a half the next morning. I have just eaten half a plateful for my luncheon. It is excellent. No man, woman or child can cry starvation on such nutritious food. So even at this early stage, the boiler was being preferred to the grinder not just because of cost, but because large-scale mills were being prioritised for private commerce and the export trade in general. On the last day of December 1846, then, we have the Central Relief Commission Office circulating directions for preparing Indian corn without grinding, and a fortnight later, its chief noted that, quote, the purchase of boilers would be most useful for the committees to make, more so than hand mills, as the soup, being the cheaper food, is the most in demand. And later on, he reiterated this on a number of letters. So this is the eclipse by the boiler of the hand mill. In turn, the boiler, the turn to the boiler, as I said, is a less market invasive form of relief technology, was long underway even prior to the soup kitchens. But once these became official policy in early 47, a huge amount of resources were directed into procuring, manufacturing, transporting and sourcing boilers. In his classic kind of micromanaging style, Trevelyan instructed Ruth on the 17th of January, quote, "What you now have to do is to go on organising the whole country, at least all the distressed parts of it, for the distribution of food. We shall be ready to attend to any suggestion you may make in regard to boilers." Over the next few weeks, a flurry of letters back and forth detailed orders for boilers from Woolwich and Liverpool, their conveyance in the hundreds to Ireland via government steamers, the adaptation of barrack boilers, and the sourcing of navy coppers and ordnance iron pots, most of which, of course, paled in comparison to the pristine standards of Alexis Sawyer's boilers. And then finally, on the 9th of February, the Treasury in a minute announced that it would pay for all boilers, that it would pay for the conveyance of all boilers, freight, everything. It was an all-out effort to get boilers to Ireland, and 600 such pots we know for sure, were distributed by the government in this period. The Quakers did about an extra additional, maybe 295. So there's about 1,000 of these things around at least. In April 1847, in an official circular issued by the Relief Commission, the authorities clarified that, quote, "The term soup in the instructions seems to have created an impression with many parties that only the liquid ordinarily so called is meant. The Relief Commissioners beg that the general term soup in their instructions may be understood to include any food cooked in a boiler." Now this seemingly innocuous redefinition of the word soup, specifically around the functionality of the boiler, was in fact critical to the whole ideological function played by this technology. This function was to ensure that food aid remained unexchangeable and could not be converted into a fungible cash form. In other words, it lay fundamentally outside the free market. And this was to be achieved through something called the cooked food test, of which the boiler was the chief technological agent. So in the Irish Crisis, Trevelyan's book, he explains frankly that, these are some boilers. The test applied to the actual receipts of relief were that the personal attendance of all parties requiring relief was insisted upon, and the relief was directed to be given only in the shape of cooked food, distributed in portions declared by the best medical authorities to be sufficient to maintain health and strength. The cooked food test found particularly efficacious in preventing abuse, and the enforcement of it in some parts of the country cost a severe struggle. Undressed meal might be converted into cash by those who did not require it as food, and even the most destitute often disposed of it for tea, tobacco or spirits. But stirabout, which becomes sour by keeping, has no value in the market, and perhaps were therefore not likely to apply for it, who did not want it for their own consumption. And about 5 years later, 5 years after he wrote this, when asked by a Lord's Select Committee to compare the early and later phases of famine relief, Trevelyan was even more direct in comparing a money-based system on the one hand and a boiler-based system. And I'm just finishing up now. What Trevelyan doesn't point out is that there was a vast bureaucratic apparatus of paper, of tickets, of slips, of perforating staples, of lists of books and ledgers and so on, which saw the soup kitchen system combine older disciplinary features of philanthropic practice with elements of kind of market style transactional technologies. And I think a good example here is the way in which relief tickets operated like a kind of quasi-fiat currency, but embedded within a specific hierarchy of exchange. So they were transferable for soup aid, which was itself unexchangeable, and they were only transferable by the issuer via name and number rather than the recipient. And these systems, like the boilers themselves, of course, often broke down, and their design and deployment was nonetheless purposeful. In a semi-confidential circular to Central Relief Committee detailing their own inspectors' reports, one anonymised account of a wild district noted that one local relief committee member, when asked, quote, "Where is the boiler?" Mr. X assured me that he only kept it from being broken by telling the people that it would not be used. So as both a disciplinary and essentially disciplinary technology designed to tether recipients to sole dependency and to completely separate them from any other mechanism of exchange, the ticket and the boiler reflected the logics of both the dispensary but especially the poor law system. And I think it was in this spirit, at least, partly that the nationalist West Cork MP A.M. Sullivan later described in his memoirs how around these boilers on the roadsides they daily moaned and shrieked and fought and scuffled, crowds of gaunt, cadaverous creatures that once had been men and women. Never would our people recover the shameful humiliation of that brutal public super boiler scheme. I should stop there.